Tonight, time for Donald Trump to deliver the peace he promised. The US president says negotiators are on their way to Russia as he pressures Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. But Moscow is making gains on the battlefield after exploiting the pause in military aid to seize back territory. So how much power does Donald Trump really have over the Kremlin? We'll be discussing that tonight. Plus, yet another escalation in the global trade war.
Canadian.
You want a Canadian today? Sure, let's do it.
In Canada, we see the quiet defiance of residents growing tired of tit-for-tat tariffs, even as Donald Trump promises even bigger taxes next month.
The United States of America is going to take back a lot of what was stolen from it by other countries.
Bullying, we're a tenth of the size of that country.
When I go to the grocery store, I look for the Canadian, that little maple leaf.
Also coming up, who are the armed separatists who killed 30 train passengers and kidnapped more than 300 in southwest Pakistan? Plus, arrested and threatened with deportation, will focus on the case of a Palestinian student activist who's been accused of supporting terrorism. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. The ball is in Russia's court. We've heard that phrase a lot over the past 24 hours. From Ukraine's leader, from Donald Trump, from his Secretary of State. The US president knows the time has come for him to deliver on his foreign policy boasts on the campaign trail.
Shortly after I win the presidency, we will have that horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It'll be settled. I know them both very well. Get it done very quickly, maybe in 24 hours.
Maybe in 24 hours, but in reality, he's at the mercy of Vladimir Putin. Because why would the Russian president agree to a ceasefire when his army is making gains in the battlefield? That's why Moscow's ambassador to the UK was so confident when we spoke to him last week. Have a listen.
Multiple plans about ceasefire temporarily for 1 month in the air and in the sea. It's a crazy idea. We will never accept it, and they are perfectly aware of that.
You heard him there. We'll never accept it. The truth is, Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of leverage. We do know he favours transactional diplomacy. He's hoping the threat of more sanctions or tariffs will make a difference.
In a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
The Russian economy has already survived for 3 years, so that may not be enough to get Russia to agree to a deal. There's a lot at stake, not least that prize he's been coveting for several years.
They will never give me a Nobel Peace Prize. It's too bad. I deserve it, but they will never give it to me.
A lot to discuss tonight, including the escalating trade war. But let's get started with a report from our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett.
After 7 months in Ukrainian hands, the town of Sudzha is apparently Russian once more. Moscow's forces here are on the march. Kiev's incursion appears almost over. For Vladimir Putin, a proud moment. On a visit to Kursk region, the commander-in-chief was the commander in camouflage, and there was no talk of a ceasefire. Quite the opposite. He wants to press home Russia's advantage.
Our task in the near future, in the shortest time possible, is to finally defeat the enemy entrenched in the Kursk region and to completely liberate the territory.
But after talks with Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, the US wants Moscow to agree to an immediate truce for 30 days. It could include a prisoner swap and the return of Ukrainian children from Russia. Kyiv hopes it'll lead to even more.
A 30-day period to fully prepare a step-by-step plan for ending the war, including security guarantees for Ukraine. If all of this is done, then after the plan is prepared and its gradual implementation begins, this will lead to the end of the war.
But agreeing to a deal that others have come up with is not how the Kremlin does business.
Vladimir Putin likes to be the one in charge. And for the past few weeks, it looked like he was, appearing to have Donald Trump's ear. But now, all of a sudden, he's on the receiving end of the American president's demands. And his agreement on this ceasefire deal might depend on what else is being tied to it.
For example, a seat at the table with the US. Their recent talks in Riyadh have opened the door to a reset of relations. But could Washington take that away if Moscow doesn't agree to its truce?
If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear.
Back home, Vladimir Putin's intentions are clear: to sell the war as a victory. But a ceasefire may not go down that well.
We don't need this. That's all I can say. This is fascists trying to replenish their forces, take a break and continue. Russia doesn't need this.
I think there should be a cessation, but a cessation of the war overall, not just some fighting. That's why there should be negotiations, to come to an agreement.
The Kremlin said it would wait for more details before making a decision. It seems they're no longer calling the shots. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, as you've been hearing, intense battles are still being fought on the front lines. Ukraine was targeted again overnight by hundreds of drones and 3 ballistic missiles. You'll remember last summer, Kyiv shocked Russia by advancing 30 kilometres into their southern Kursk region. This map shows the territory they still held at the start of this month. Highlighted in yellow there on your screen. Well, land Zelensky had said could be swapped for Russian-held territory in Ukraine. But since then, Russia has begun to push Ukraine back, seizing the land shown here in orange. Well, let's bring in Richard Engel, Chief Foreign Correspondent for NBC News, and of course, my co-host on our podcast, The World. Richard, really good to see you. I mean, we've been talking about this issue on the podcast, on and off air, for, I guess months, even since the beginning of this conflict. And at different points, we've talked about whether or not Russia has been emboldened. Seeing Vladimir Putin, in Kursk tonight, it does feel like, ahead of these talks around a potential ceasefire, that he is emboldened.
Well, he's certainly playing to a domestic audience. The front lines here in Ukraine have been more or less static for well over a year now. I'm in the city of Mykolaiv, not very far from the front lines. This is a city that is still under attack by Russian drones. Yalda, you notice it's pitch black. It was light outside here before with the city lights. They all just went out. There are rolling blackouts in this part of the country. There were air raid sirens here not long ago. But the battle lines have more or less been fixed, except when first the Ukrainians took this piece of Russian territory in Kursk, and now over the last several weeks, and then really over the last several days, the Russians have been making tremendous advances. And it seems that Vladimir Putin was able to go out there, put on a uniform, show the Russian people that Russian troops are making progress, they are making advances, and they are recapturing their own territory. Because at the end of the day, Ukrainians captured land inside Russia. That's a dynamic that isn't often understood in this conflict, and it seems like they're losing it. And here in Ukraine, people believe they are losing it in part because Donald Trump played hardball with them, cut off intelligence, cut off U.S. military support. The U.S. intelligence suspension had an immediate impact because, as you know, Ukraine depends on American intelligence, foreign intelligence in general, not only for targeting in places like Kursk, but also to enact defenses to fight against Russian drones and ballistic missiles.
Yeah, Richard, I mean, you've been going in and out of Ukraine. You were there just a few weeks ago. You're back there now. Just a sense from the Ukrainians about how they feel about this moment and how things are developing. Because, of course, we saw what happened to President Zelensky at the Oval Office. He's now been invited back. But what are Ukrainians saying about perhaps the kind of concessions they're going to have to make to get this over the line?
So I think people just trying to watch this conflict anywhere in the world, their heads are spinning, not knowing what the American position is from one day to the next. Is the U.S. an ally of Ukraine? Is it an enemy? here in Ukraine, these issues are deadly serious. They're fighting the war every single day. The peace proposal that they're talking about could potentially see Ukraine give up 20% of its land to Russia, potentially forever, changing the map of this country. So this is an existential question. And just a few weeks ago, they saw President Zelensky humiliated in the Oval Office by President Trump. They saw military aid and intelligence cut. Now, apparently, Trump and Zelensky are friendly again and trying to turn the table on Vladimir Putin. But I can say people here have lost trust in the United States, lost trust in the consistency of American foreign policy.
Well, Richard, we can see the details of our podcast on the screen there. You can, of course, to our audiences, you can scan and listen and follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple or Spotify. Follow Richard and I, and we will bring you up to date on the developing situation in Ukraine. Richard, thanks so much. Stay safe. Now, last night, we focused on how Donald Trump's tariff diplomacy was shocking the markets. The White House and business leaders will be heartened by better-than-expected inflation figures released today. But the US president is already trailing his next big move, a tax on all countries around the world to impose duties on American imports. He made the comments as he met the Irish Prime Minister in the Oval Office. Stephen Murphy travelled with Michal Martin and sent us this report.
Most years, when the visiting media pile into the Oval Office for the St. Patrick's meeting, they expect a cosy chat. But this year, this White House is so different. Michal Martin was braced for a list of Donald Trump's grievances against the Irish trade surplus, against the EU, and that means tariffs.
Will you put more tariffs on the EU? Will you respond to their retaliation?
Of course I'm going to respond.
You will retaliate with more tariffs.
The problem is our country didn't respond. Look, the EU was set up in order to take advantage of the United States.
Including Ireland? Is Ireland taking advantage of the US?
Of course they are. I can't, I have great respect for Ireland and what they did. And they should have done just what they did. But the United States shouldn't have let it happen. We had stupid leaders.
There was almost a sneaking admiration for the way Ireland has exploited US multinationals. Again and again, it was the European Union that bore the brunt of the president's ire.
I'm not happy with the European Union, I want to tell you. And,
will you put tariffs
and
on
we're
cars?
going to win that. We're going to win that financial battle. It's a financial
battle. European cars, Mr. President? Tariffs on European cars? Is that something you're now considering?
Oh, absolutely. I will do that. Yeah.
Mr. President,
think of it. They have millions of cars coming in, millions and millions of cars. One of probably the largest. Japan's very big too, but and they don't accept our cars. We make great cars. They don't have our cars, but we have their cars.
Trade wars are big, but they're felt by small firms. It's a long way from DC to rural County Meath, but here a cream liqueur firm that exports to 6 US states awaits new tariffs anxiously.
Look, we'll just have to persevere. We have no choice. We've put a lot of investment and effort into the US market, so we're going to keep going. It's like everything else, just the not knowing. So it's very hard to make plans with my distributors.
Back in Washington, the meeting wrapped without firm details about any new penalties for Europe. In truth, Michal Martin will be pretty relieved at how that went. Donald Trump may have said Ireland is taking advantage of the United States, but it seems clear he regards the European Union as the true culprit, not Ireland specifically. A St. Patrick's meeting that in any other year would be considered incredibly confrontational. Now the Irish feel lucky, Europe perhaps less so.
And Stephen joins us live now from the White House. And I mean, Stephen, we're getting all too used to these images of leaders making their way to the White House, to the Oval Office, and then this sort of performance, where they try and charm and appease Trump, but also gently push back where they have to. Just give us a sense of what it was like being in that room. I know it's a very small, cramped room, and then suddenly, it turned into a sort of informal press conference like it has on so many other occasions.
Yeah, such a solemn room, isn't it? Imbued with such significance, such power, such history. And then it just turns into essentially a free-for-all, a sort of frenetic media circus. But of course, that's the way these meetings tend to go. And, It is interesting, as you say, when you look at the likes of Macron or Starmer or President Zelensky, the different ways that foreign leaders have been trying to figure out just how to handle Donald Trump on his home turf. I think the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, will feel like he did a pretty good job of walking that tightrope today. And it was an approach that I think we knew in advance that he was going to take. He had to walk a balance. He had to walk a balancing line between being the leader of the Irish government, of course, but also leader of a core part of the European Union, the villain of the peace at the moment, as far as Donald Trump is concerned. And of course, we spoke to Donald Trump about his plans for further retaliatory tariffs on the European Union's retaliatory tariffs, and he certainly, as you saw there in the report, seemed to have absolutely no hesitation at hinting or indicating that he was going to pull the trigger on further punitive measures. All the while, an EU Prime Minister is sitting right next to him, and essentially the body language wasn't as pally or sort of a bromance as we saw with, say, President Macron. He didn't rise to the bait as we saw with the unfortunate Ukrainian president. He struck a sort of fairly low-key approach, and he was very keen as well to point out that, look, investment between Ireland and the US goes both ways. He gave the example of Ryanair, which purchases huge amounts of Boeing aircraft, and I think, given a huge amount of apprehensiveness and nervousness that we detected in Dublin, the Irish delegation will be wrapping up the St. Patrick's festivities here this evening in pretty good form. They think they got off pretty lightly in the bear pit that is the Trump Oval Office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw how it ended for President Zelensky. Thanks so much, Stephen. Well, Donald Trump's trade war has taken aim at America's closest neighbour, but the UK and EU are also affected. It's hard to keep up in this tit-for-tat battle, so I just want to give you a quick reminder. Have a look at this. 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports into the US came into effect this morning. The EU then announced counter-tariffs on goods worth 26 billion euros, nearly 22 billion pounds. Those will come in from the 1st of April. UK steel exports to the US are worth more than 350 million pounds annually, with the bulk of that coming from stainless steel. The government here says, although it is disappointed, it will not retaliate while a wider UK-US trade deal is being negotiated. Then this afternoon, Canada confirmed its own countermeasures, more taxes on more US goods to come into effect tomorrow. Well, let's go straight to our Martha Kellner, who's been finding out whether Canadians are tariff fatigued. Martha, over to you.
Yeah, Yalda, there's turmoil in the markets at the moment, but turmoil in the minds of Canadians too, a real sense of whiplash. They simply don't know where the next tariffs are going to come from, or if they're indeed just a threat, if they're part of these negotiations, or if they will actually come into effect. I've spent the last few days here in British Columbia, and there's a real sense of uncertainty over these tariffs, over the potential economic impact. But also they feel they're beholden to the whims of one man. They feel like they're beholden to the whims of Donald Trump. And they say they simply don't know why Canada is all of a sudden being picked on in their minds. I've been speaking to people to find out what they make of it all.
So we'll do a Canadiano.
A coffee shop on Vancouver Island and a quiet act of defiance.
Should have a Canadiano.
You want a Canadiano today? Please. Sure, let's do it.
But beneath the bravado, a seething sense of betrayal.
You know, this bullying, you know, we're a tenth of the size of that country, you know, 300 million or 400 million people in the States and about 40 million in Canada. But we picked no fight. But it just keeps coming to us.
On the top shelf, Alan hides the labels of American-made bottles.
Tennessee, Wayne Gretzky cream, and it's just about empty anyway.
Wayne Gretzky cream liqueur, once a Canadian ice hockey hero, now considered a traitor for his support of Trump.
He's proven that he doesn't even respect our country anymore.
In just the past few days, Canadians have been subject to an on-off, tit-for-tat whirlwind of economic punishments.
11 even.
One day, a threat of 50% tariffs on Canadian aluminium and steel, then revised back down to 25%. And now, the Canadian retaliation.
Et une minute, demain,
Starting at 12:01 a.m., March 13th, reciprocal tariffs of 25% on $29.8 billion worth of imports coming from the United States.
And the threats don't end at tariffs. Trump wants to make Canada the 51st state. It's not being taken lightly by the leader of this province.
I've been speaking to people, British Columbians, yesterday. They're genuinely fearful of annexation. Do you think that's a possibility, and are you scared?
So I find it deeply unsettling. The advice that we get continually about the president is to take him seriously, but not literally. I would love to have that kind of luxury. And the danger, I think, is not taking him literally and seriously.
Thanks for staying with BC Ferries. On the ferry which links Vancouver Island with the mainland, there's real tariff fatigue. What do you think the end game of all this is?
Just to cause chaos, that's what I think. So yeah, not too thrilled about it, but it's kind of galvanized Canadians together, so that's the silver lining.
I was planning a trip to Las Vegas. We've cancelled that. Now we're going to Salt Spring Island. When I go to the grocery store, I look for the Canadian, that little maple leaf that a lot of grocery stores have put on the shelves to, try and purchase Canadian items or Mexican items, anything other than the United States.
You think his main aim is to make you weaker?
Without a doubt. Yeah, that was his game plan from the beginning. So it had nothing to do with fentanyl going into the United States. That was just a ruse.
Fentanyl is a national tragedy shared by Canada and the US. The streets of Vancouver, a painful reminder of that. But the Trump administration claims there are secret fentanyl laboratories across Canada, and that the ruinous opioid is flooding over the border. It's the reason, they say, for starting this trade war. A bogus excuse, say others.
There is no one who knows anything about drug markets in North America who would agree with the statement that Canada is a substantial part of the problem in the United States. It's simply a fiction. It's simply a lie. No question that fentanyl has devastated the United States. Fentanyl is devastating Canada. And so I think in that way, it might be a potent way for Mr. Trump to whip up enthusiasms and to justify this aggression.
Whatever the reason, invented or otherwise, for this trade war, it's making an enemy of this ally. The question is, what power does Canada really have in the face of its much bigger, far wealthier neighbour?
Canadians are not known for being particularly angry or outspoken, are they? But there is a real and clear fury here among the Canadian people, and a sense of disbelief about just how quickly this relationship has deteriorated between this brother-sister country, these friends, how they've become foes so quickly in the space of a matter of weeks, really, and a sense of fear too about just where this goes, what happens next, not just in terms of tariffs, but also this anxiety, this genuine anxiety about the possibility, the potential of annexation.
Yeah, absolutely, Martha. I mean, we heard it in Mark Carney's voice, and so many people talking about the fact that this has really united Canadians. Martha, thank you so much for all of your reporting. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come on the programme, Donald Trump is applying pressure on Vladimir Putin, but just how successful will his approach to peace in Ukraine be? Stay with us.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre.
Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
A show of military might and menace.
Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day.
It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov.
The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, who was first on display. Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back. Let's return now to the war in Ukraine. President Trump has seemingly made it a personal mission to secure peace there. To find out how successful Mr. Trump's approach might be, I spoke to Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for a New American Security, who was also a top foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain. I asked him about the likelihood of Vladimir Putin agreeing to a ceasefire.
I hope that they will agree to the ceasefire. I don't know that they will. I think it's going to be hard for Putin to not agree because, frankly, he's not going to get a better posture out of an American administration than the one he has right now, either than he would have had if Donald Trump wasn't president or if he says no to what the Americans have now put on the table. So he's in a little bit of a short-term jam. I think the likeliest is that he will take the ceasefire and maybe do 30 days and then look for ways probably to undermine it during that time and blame any failure of it on the Ukrainians and the Europeans themselves.
Which is something that the Ukrainians have sort of been arguing, that we've had previous ceasefires, namely Minsk 1 and 2, and the Russians have broken those ceasefires.
Right. So the Ukrainians have said time and time again, including in the Oval Office in this now infamous meeting, that the ceasefires before haven't worked and that the Ukrainians need security guarantees from countries in Europe or preferably from the United States in order for a ceasefire to stick, because they have this experience in Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 where there were these ceasefires in the east and the Russians undermined these ceasefires and the Ukrainians were, mostly defenseless other than what they had to bring to the table. And so they don't have a lot of faith that this is going to work this time around. However, this is what the Americans put on the table, and I think it was right for Zelensky to sort of say, okay, we'll do this. And now, really, the ball is in the Russian court.
We were together in Munich, and we both listened to the speech made by J.D. Vance. Just sitting in Washington, are you concerned about a potential split in transatlantic relations? Do you think there is a split, or do you think this is some kind of moment of reckoning, especially for Europe to step up?
there's some split. I think some of the reactions are overdrawn. I mean, I guess I'm old enough now to remember the Iraq War, which was extremely divisive between the U.S. and some European countries, and people said things will never be the same again. Of course, if you go back further than that, there was the Vietnam War and other controversial things in the transatlantic relationship. This is different, but I think some of these declarations of European independence from the United States are declarations only and are not going to go too far. The reality is there's a lot of value in the transatlantic relationship. There's a lot of value in NATO. Sometimes it will take even our current president a while to come around to that understanding.
For the last few weeks, I mean, Donald Trump has been in power for, 6 or 7 weeks now. A lot has happened. Certainly he's used tariffs as a tool. He says it's his favourite word in the dictionary. Do you think that's going to cause more grief for the United States? Because we're seeing, I mean, regardless of what Donald Trump thinks he can do in terms of pressure on these states, the markets speak for themselves. Things like inflation will speak for itself. Recession will speak for itself. Donald Trump can't control those things.
Right. So, yes, this means tough times for the United States. He has put tariffs on our top 3 trade partners in Mexico, Canada, and China in very significant amounts as well. And already in 6 or 7 weeks, he's put more tariffs on more goods and more countries than he did in all 4 years of his first term combined. So this is a big thing. Of course, this has also elicited reciprocal tariffs from a bunch of countries, including those 3. So far, not from Britain. But, there's 2 things going on right here. One is the tariffs, which are not good for the economy. The other is the unpredictability and the lurching up and down, the imposition of tariffs one day, the suspension of them the next, then it's going to be 30 days. No, then it only applies to these goods, but not these other ones. Even we saw yesterday the imposition literally for a number of hours, a doubling of tariffs on Canada before those were rescinded. And that unpredictability is not good for, as everyone probably knows, for business investment and for overall economic performance.
But when we look at the situation in the United States, the fast-paced way in which Donald Trump reacts to things and the decisions he makes, do you still think, though, it is incredibly difficult to kind of turn a ship like the United States within the space of 4 years, that fundamentally, we've those who are concerned about the current situation, whether it's transatlantic relations or relations of the United States with Russia or even the situation with China, that actually we just have to wait 2 more years to the midterms or wait 4 more years to the next election?
Yeah, I mean, we clearly have checks and balances in our system, both the formal ones, because Congress, which is pretty quiescent at the moment, but, as you said, a midterm election is looming not that far off, and the politics of this will start to catch up with some of the impacts that different policies are having. The courts, we've already seen rulings on particular presidential decisions, the reaction of other countries, including our friends and allies, the conduct of states, all 50 states, of what they're doing, and then the markets, which is sort of this informal kind of check. And at least in the first term, we saw when the markets reacted poorly to something, President Trump often took it back, and then when they reacted well, he sort of kept it in place. So the president is doing a lot. He's throwing a lot of policy changes out there very, very quickly. Not all of these are going to endure, and I think things will settle down at least a little bit as we get to the medium term. The question is just, when's the medium term start?
That was Richard Fontaine, the CEO of CNAS. Well, this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up on the programme, can the Trump administration legally deport a Palestinian student activist? We'll focus on the case of Mahmoud Khalil.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
Welcome back. I just want to return to a story that we've covered a lot last May. You remember these images, pro-Palestinian student camps being cleared from the grounds of universities across the United States. Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, he's been withdrawing hundreds of millions in funding from educational institutions he deems to have mishandled the demonstrators. One of the figureheads of the movement was graduate student Mahmoud Khalil. Over the weekend, he was arrested by immigration officers accused of supporting Hamas and threatened with deportation.
These are very difficult circumstances. Mahmoud and his wife, the last thing they expected was for something like this to happen. They had every reason to expect stability. He's a lawful permanent resident. She's a U.S. citizen. They're about to welcome their firstborn child next month. That's what they were thinking about, not this scenario where he's abducted, coming home at night, and rendered to a location 1,000 miles away by the U.S. government on account of his speech. In light of that, Mahmoud, of course, is a fighter. He's been a prominent advocate for Palestinian rights. He's equally unbowed. He's in good spirits considering these circumstances, and he looks forward to being back here at home in New York.
That's the lawyer for a Columbia University student, Mahmoud Khalil. Well, let's speak now to Carrie DeSalle. She's from the Knight First Amendment Institute, which promotes freedom of expression. She's also a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. Thank you so much, Carrie, for joining us here on the programme. Before we begin the interview, I just want to bring up a post on Truth Social that President Trump posted just after the arrest. He said, ICE proudly apprehended and detained Mahmoud Khalil, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student on the campus of Columbia University. This is the first arrest of many to come. We know there are more students at Columbia and other universities across the country who've engaged in pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity, and the Trump administration will not tolerate it. Carrie, I just want you to react to the statement by the president and of course, the actual arrest itself.
Yes, happy to speak with you. The statement by the president that you just read is one of many in the president's long campaign of threats to round up and deport student protesters based on their political speech in the United States. And of course, the arrest and detention of Mahmoud Khalil is the first key example of the president's efforts to carry out those threats. And in this case, Khalil is a lawful permanent resident in the United States who has full First Amendment rights when it comes to engaging in political speech in this country. And the Supreme Court has recognized since World War II that U.S. residents like Khalil do have the protection of the First Amendment. So the efforts to carry out President Trump's threats to round up and deport these student protesters carry clear constitutional concerns, and in this case, I think is clearly unconstitutional itself.
Yeah, and we understand that Mahmoud Khalil is held in detention in Louisiana, I believe. Even though he's from New York, he's been sent to a detention facility there. The courts have sort of asked for a pause to all of this because, as you've pointed out, they want to kind of further investigate this before any move is made to deport him. Do you worry that perhaps the courts might get ignored?
In this case, no. There's a lot to worry about. My hope is that the government at least will comply with court orders. Certainly, Judge Furman has already ordered that Khalil not be deported while these proceedings are pending in his court. And my full expectation is that ICE and the U.S. government will comply with those orders and not secret Khalil away again and, in clear defiance of those orders.
We've also heard the president say that he is one of many. What does that mean to you? And is there now concern that others will get arrested, rounded up, sent to detention facilities? We understand that another student, ICE had approached the other student, but the door was not opened at the time and they couldn't enter.
Yes. That's right. I think the fears of these actions being taken out again and again with respect to other student protesters and other protesters across the country are widespread at this point. The threat of rounding up and deporting these student protesters was quite clearly intended to chill this protected First Amendment activity, and it has had that effect. People are now scared to show up at protests, to engage with organizations that they previously engaged with, to exercise their First Amendment rights in this country.
Carrie, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to bring you up to date on another developing story that we have been tracking. The former leader of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, is now in the custody of the International Criminal Court after he was arrested yesterday. He's accused of crimes against humanity over his anti-drug crackdown. The 79-year-old arrived in the Netherlands earlier today after being flown from Manila. Well, let's go to our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, who joins us from The Hague tonight. And Siobhan, I'm thinking back to that time that Rodrigo Duterte was president, and up to 30,000 people died on his watch. He's now arrived at The Hague. Just talk us through what's likely to happen now.
Well, that's right, Yalda. So basically, as you say, the former president has arrived here in The Hague. He's been accused of crimes against humanity, specifically murder. And these allegations relate to the period when he was the mayor of Davao, but also the president, surrounding this so-called war on drugs. Campaigners say up to 30,000 people were killed under that. He's been accused of heading up death squads, which targeted drug users and also drug dealers. The authorities claim around 6,000 people died. And Duterte always said that he only ever told police to shoot in self-defense. But the ICC have been investigating for several years. They picked him up today. They brought him here. Now, we understand that he's been seen by a doctor, that he's been given warm clothes. He's spoken to his lawyer, and at some point in the next few days, he'll go to court to hear the charges against him. And then if prosecutors can convince the court that there is enough to continue with this trial, well, that process in reality could take years. If he is eventually found guilty of these crimes against humanity, that could be a life sentence. Now, it's interesting, he, his family, some of whom have come here, and his supporters say he did nothing wrong, that he made the streets of the Philippines safer, whereas those who are against him say that he needs to face justice here, and they're celebrating the fact that the ICC have detained him.
Siobhan, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up on the programme, from Greenland to Gaza, where could Donald Trump turn his attention to next? We'll be joined by Kenneth Roth, former Executive Director of the Human Rights Watch.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts. I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky's security and defense editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
It felt akin to riding into some sort of Armageddon.
Many other areas have been hit badly. There are shells coming in every few minutes.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
Oh.
Getting up close and personal with a rhino.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live. I'm live in Jerusalem.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place and all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. Now, it might not be an election that often piques much interest, but all eyes, including those of US President Donald Trump, have been set on Greenland over the last few days in what will be seen as a blow for Donald Trump. The country's centre-right Democratic Party, which favours a slower approach to independence from Denmark, secured the highest share of the vote. Now, President Trump had been hoping the election would provide a mandate for the people of Greenland to break away from Denmark into his own welcoming arms. But with 30% of the vote, the Democratic Party has no intention of handing the island over to the United States. Well, with the fate of Greenland seemingly in its own hands, where will Donald Trump cast his gaze next? Well, let's ask Kenneth Roth, former executive director of Human Rights Watch and author of Righting Wrongs. Ken, always really good to see you and speak to you. I was just recently reading an article you wrote in The Guardian where you talk about, the fact that even a leader like Donald Trump can be convinced to do the right thing if you know how to convince him. Given your experience working with so many global leaders over the years, just talk about, how you've sort of come to that conclusion.
Well, what I describe in my book is that there's always an angle, and regardless of how brutal the dictator is, there's always something they want, something they care about. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, to say you're violating human rights gets you nothing. He'll say, what are human rights? But he does care about, he's got this ego, and he wants to be known as a master negotiator who makes great deals. And so for the wrong reason, we can get him to do the right thing. By basically saying, you want to be known for a good deal, say in Ukraine, it's not enough to just stop the fighting with a ceasefire. You're going to have to provide security guarantees so Putin cannot proceed with his real plan, which is to crush Ukraine's democracy.
It's interesting because we often hear people say, Donald Trump really wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And actually, I don't think that's a joke. I think he genuinely...
I think he totally does. He says it, and it's great because this gives him something to aspire to, and it gives us something to deprive him of unless he does the right thing. So, in Gaza, where he really wants the Nobel Peace Prize, it's not going to be by getting rid of the Palestinians. It's going to be by persuading Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, which will not happen without a clear pathway to a Palestinian state. It's the last thing Netanyahu wants, but Trump has the capacity to twist Netanyahu's arm. He did that to get agreement to this temporary ceasefire now, and he could do it for a Palestinian state. That's not where Trump is right now, but if we can persuade him that you don't get the Nobel Peace Prize without doing that, this guy can, flip like that. And that's our aim.
Yeah, it's interesting on the Gaza situation because we saw the Biden administration go back and forth on a ceasefire deal for a year, and it cost over a year. It cost tens of thousands of lives in the end. Yet Donald Trump was able to do it quite quickly.
Well, I think Biden, in the case of Israel, said a lot of the right things. He said, don't starve Palestinians, be more careful when you're bombing. But he was never able to back that up with the leverage that he had, which is to condition the ongoing U.S. arms sales and military aid. Trump implicitly was saying that. There's nobody to the right of Trump. So if Netanyahu didn't listen to Trump, he was in trouble. And that's why Netanyahu immediately complied with that ceasefire. Trump didn't even have to make explicit threats because it was all implicit. So, this is a guy who is not easy to work with, but he has his ambitions. He's got his fragile ego. He has his odd self-images. We've got to work with that and make him realize he doesn't get the ego gratification he wants without, for the wrong reason, nudging in the right direction.
So are you saying to ignore the noise, the AI videos that he puts out on Gaza, the talk of pushing Gazans out, and just focus on, he managed to get the ceasefire. He wants the relationship with the Saudis. He wants normalization. Yeah. He did try and, he achieved the Abraham Accords in his first and felt it was never really acknowledged.
Yeah. Well, in terms of his plan to forcibly deport 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, it is important to focus on that because that's a massive war crime. That's a crime against humanity. So you have to say no to that. That's, what the far-right Israeli ministers want, but it's utterly unacceptable. At this stage, Egypt and Jordan, despite risking their U.S. military assistance, have said no way. The Saudis and the Emiratis said, we're not going to fund the rebuilding of Gaza without Palestinians. So, it was important to focus on that, put a definitive stop to it, and I think we have. Now the options are on the table are, do you have the one-state reality with equal rights for everybody? The Israeli government says, no, we would lose our Jewish majority. Do you have the status quo, endless occupation, which is apartheid? That's unacceptable. The best option is the two-state solution, an Israeli and Palestinian state side by side. That's what we need to push for.
Ken, I have about a minute, yes. 30 left, but I want to ask you if you think he's going to be able to achieve peace in the war in Ukraine.
At this point, Zelensky and the Ukrainians are rightfully saying it's not enough just to stop the fighting because Putin will use that time to replenish his depleted forces, to rearm, and to reinvade. Because Putin doesn't care about a little terrain in eastern Ukraine. He wants to quash Ukraine's democracy so it doesn't serve as a model for the Russian people who right now just have an autocracy. So the Europeans, the British and the French, are willing to put peacekeepers there. They need a U.S. backstop. Trump is saying no. He's saying, you've got my mining deal, as if anybody cares about that. So we need to make him realize that if he doesn't provide this backstop, if he appeases Putin, the deal will fail. He will be seen as having been bamboozled by Putin. He will be the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century. His legacy will be tarnished. That's not what he wants. We need to persuade him of that.
And in this moment, briefly, do you think that he can call Putin's bluff by saying the ball's in your court? Putin's not going to come back and respond in a positive way?
Putin is going to come back with all kinds of conditions. He's going to say, yeah, I'll agree to a temporary ceasefire, no European peacekeepers on the ground. Yeah, I'll agree to a ceasefire, start moving NATO back from Eastern Europe. So he's going to come in with unreasonable conditions, and we got to say no, because any unreasonable condition accepted now for the temporary ceasefire will be carried over into the permanent one.
Ken, it's always really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me, Yalda.
So that was the programme this evening. As you heard us say earlier, that we've been hearing this phrase, that the ball is in Russia's court. Steve Witkoff, the envoy for Donald Trump, will be in Russia tomorrow, and we'll have more news on the developments there as we wait to hear from the Russian side. For now, good night.